Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up this idea of landscape protection, preservation, those ideas. So we were talking about in the last lecture marine protected areas. This is the map of Belize, and I was mentioning the different protected areas. No-take zones are the red ones, yellow management, special management areas, and then blue is a multi-use. You have to have a combination. You can't just say everything's off limits. It doesn't work. You won't have public support. You won't have the public invested in the protection, and then you're going to see your resources destroyed and just eliminated. So it's not sustainable long term to go that route. All right, so how do we then find ways to balance the needs of people with protection, conservation, all of those concerns and challenges? This is where we get into conservation and economic development. So how do you do these things together, and how do you do it where it's sustainable? This is where ecotourism comes into the picture. Now, that term has a lot of different meanings. There's a broad spectrum to what ecotourism is considered. The general definition we're going to go with is tourism that is ecologically and socially sustainable. Okay, so ecologically sustainable meaning we're not destroying the environment people come to see, and socially sustainable, will the people who live there continue to support this? And the best way to encourage the social sustainability, make them involved, get them involved, have the locals run the parks, have the locals be the guides, have the locals run the businesses. Then they will have an investment in this, and you'll be far more successful. So again, I can talk for hours on examples of people in Belize that are doing this because of the work I do there, the friends I've made. They're invested in the rainforest because they know that is their livelihood. That's where their money comes from. So they don't want to destroy it. They want to protect it because they realize, hey, if I lose this, I've lost my job. My business fails. What am I going to do then to take care of my family? Biosphere reserves are ways to work with ecotourism, establishing these reserves and understanding what you can do in each of the reserves. So a biosphere reserve is a protected area that's divided into usage zones. Right? Now, each zone has a different level of usage, so we'll take a look at that next. So here's an example of Biosphere Reserve. And we can see a similar model in those marine protected areas as well. The bigger the reserve, the better, because you have less edge effect. Now, what we do is we start in the center, and you say, okay, here's your core area. This is off limits. This core area, maybe you do research in there, but that's it. It needs to be as large as possible, especially if you're going to try to preserve a jaguar. The buffer zone surrounds the core area. That buffer zone, you do have some use of that. You use it for some ecotourism. Maybe we do low impact camping, we do nature hikes, we do bird watching. We're not living here, we're just in appreciation of nature and then out. And then the outer zone is what we refer to as a multiple use area. So we saw this in the marine protected area. Maybe this is farming. Maybe this is where your road systems are. You might have some settlements, habitats, houses, villages on the edge of the buffer zone. So you expect people to be in here. The challenge is we need to draw that line and go, you can't build past this point, because if we start encroaching and putting houses in here, then we put more pressure, and then we push ecotourism further in, and then that reduces the size of our core area, and it starts to compromise things. So we don't want these circles to get smaller and smaller and smaller. We want to draw those lines and make it clear this is the parameter or the boundaries of each of these zones. You can establish farming practices and say, okay, you can farm in this multiple use zone, but anything on the edge of the buffer zone, you have to leave standing crops. Maybe you have to leave 2 acres of standing corn as a food source for the animals in the buffer zone, because then that improves the animal life, which improves your ecotourism. So there's ways to do this. It's all possible. It's just, can you get the community behind it? Can you get public support and the community behind this? If you can convince them, this will bring in dollars. This will bring in revenue through ecotourism, and they can see that and they can invest in it, then you have a greater chance of success with a biosphere reserve. So look into this kind of stuff, especially in developing countries. This is what they're doing. They're getting smart. They're recognizing they have to do it this way to make sure they have a future. Costa Rica was the leader in this. Back in the 80s, they established ecotourism. The challenge, they didn't have a model to follow, so they stumbled, they made lots of mistakes. They still did great things. I'm not saying Costa Rica is, I'm not knocking them and saying they're bad. They did great things, but they did make some significant mistakes with how they set up some of their projects. And we're seeing other countries that are now getting into the ecotourism game, using Costa Rica as a model and taking the best practices and using those for their reserves and their projects. All right, so it is definitely possible. We also can apply the same idea here in the United States if we were to do a biosphere reserve. So the challenge is the size of the reserve or preserve. The design of it becomes really, really difficult to figure out sometimes. Sometimes the topography of the land dictates this. You got a river here, you have a mountain range there, you have these types of geological features that may dictate how you design your preserve. But there's this Schloss debate, S-L-O-S-S. Single, large, or several small reserves. What's better? That's going to depend upon the biome you're looking at. So it's not a one model fits everything. In some cases, it's better to have one large, gigantic section of land because you reduce, remember that thing, edge effect? I keep coming back to that because it's so important when we talk about habitat. This has less of an edge effect than if you combined this section, and this section. Those, number 1, that's supposed to be a 2, sorry. Number 2, number 3 combined probably equal the same amount of land area as number 4. But look at number 3, major edge effect. You don't really have any interior core area that doesn't feel the effects of the edge of that habitat. So depending on the species, number 4 might be the only thing that's going to work for that species. Other species, maybe number 3. The several small, that might be a better model when you're working in urban areas to go, okay, we can't get 300 acres in Springfield. It doesn't exist. Can we get 2 acres here, 2 acres there, 5 acres over there? Possible. But then can you link them together? That becomes a challenge. Okay, can we link this with these things they call corridors? So we're going to link number 1 to number 2 with a corridor like this, habitat corridor. It's not the same habitat as what you find in the dark green, but it potentially allows wildlife to travel like this, to get from 1 to 2. or it goes through here. Challenge is, hey, I'm going to pop up a campground in here. What if that mountain lion decides, I don't want to walk all the way around like this to go into number 2. I'm going to take a shortcut. Oh, there's a tent. Oh, what's in that tent? Oh, no, okay, now I'm making my way down to habitat number 2. So sometimes a design has to be really considered carefully before we say, here it is, and this is what's going to work. Corridors are great. They're better than no corridor. You break a corridor, you isolate a population. That's not good. So if development came in and eliminated these corridors here, for whatever reason, we change the habitat. Now, habitat or pocket number 1 is isolated from number 2 for certain species. Birds, sure, they'll fly over there. So will insects. But your squirrels, they're probably not going from 1 to 2 because there's too much in between that could kill them. So they're going to stay in 1. That can significantly mess with the genetic diversity of a population. You now have, again, created 2 isolated populations. Gene flow is cut off. You're going to have more genetic drift. You're going to see some problems down the road with these populations. We want mixing of genes. We want populations to move back and forth between those 2 environments or all 4 environments. So that way we don't get into a bottlenecking effect. So hopefully that sounds a little familiar with evolution, the bottleneck effect. So the big questions, we need core habitat. It has to be of a certain size for each species. If we're talking about frogs, it's probably a smaller sized habitat than if we're talking about the jaguar. So it's critical for species survival. And then those corridors are the links, the lifelines between the different core areas, between 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. You need it. Great project. Again, I keep referring to Belize because all the work I do there. They are working with the jaguar corridor, and actually it's all of Central America. They're trying to link all the different countries in Central America with a continuous corridor so jaguars can travel from Mexico, potentially southern United States, all the way down to Argentina and always stay in protected areas. Massive undertaking. They've started, they've had some success, but then they kind of take 2 steps forward, a step back. Hopefully they continue to take steps forward. The research we do in Belize, that information can then be used to help support the Jaguar Corridor project and why we want to be doing this. We just need to do a lot more in-depth and detailed research if we really, really want to get a better picture of what's going on there. So the question then comes to be, how small can a habitat be? There is no minimum size. It just depends on the species you're trying to preserve. So to determine minimum size, I know everybody who's been in a class with me before has heard this. Those who have not had my course, you may not be familiar with the 10% rule of energy. Your producer base sends 10% of the energy up to the herbivores. The herbivores send 10% up to the carnivores, and so on. It works on a 10% rule. So if your habitat here has 2,000 units of energy from the producers, only 200 units of energy are going to make it up to the next consumer, then 20, and then 2. Is that enough to support the species you're trying to support? Depends on what's at the top of the food chain. Obviously, the bigger this habitat, the bigger, off the screen, there we go. The bigger the producer base, the more energy that goes up, the more levels that you can get, and the more successful your conservation project will be. All right, so make sure you guys have the basic concepts. ideas behind preserving landscapes and how we connect that to species preservation. We'll then move into restoration ecology next.